The longhouse was quiet, the kind of quiet that only came after a feast when everybody had eaten too much, drunk too deeply, and slept too long. Somewhere in the far end of the room, someone snored softly. Someone else shifted on a wooden bench. With a sigh, the fire in the center had burned down to coals, faint orange light still pulsing under the logs. She opened her eyes. The woolen blanket was scratchy against her cheek. Her hair was tangled from the braid she'd half untied last night. She didn't quite remember when they'd fallen asleep, or how they'd ended up lying this close. But there he was, this man she had married just yesterday. She did not move, not yet. Instead, she looked at him through her eyelashes. His beard was longer than she'd thought when she first met him. Neatly tied at the end, but wild around the cheeks. It made him look slightly untamed, in a way that both startled and intrigued her. His mouth was relaxed in sleep. One hand was curled under his chin. The other, much to her surprise, was resting loosely between them, almost, but not quite, touching her wrist. He smelled like hearth smoke and pine tar soap, and something else, something faint and sweet she couldn't place. Maybe honey mead from last night's cup. Maybe the faint, lingering scent of fresh linen, though she knew full well he hadn't worn new clothes in weeks. She shifted slightly. The wooden platform creaked beneath her. She held her breath, hoping he wouldn't, but his eyelids fluttered. He turned his head toward her eyes, still foggy with sleep, and blinked once. Then again, and then he smiled. A slow, hesitant smile. Not wide or overconfident, just a small acknowledgement. "Good morning," he said softly, voice hoarse from sleep. She nodded. Her lips curved into a tiny smile in return. "Good morning." They looked at each other. Not like lovers, not like strangers either. Like two people trying to measure a quiet moment that didn't need to be hurried. The longhouse was still dim. Smoke curled gently toward the roof from the dying hearth fire. Someone in the distance coughed and turned over. The outside world had not fully awakened. Neither had they. She pulled the blanket up a little higher. There had been so many people last night. Cousins and aunts and friends from neighboring farms. The feast had gone on far too long. The dancing, the mead, the endless congratulations. Someone had played a lyre. Someone had fallen into a cooking pot. There had been stories and songs and toasts. And then, finally, they had been led here. To this bed at the far corner of the longhouse, shielded only by a curtain of hanging furs. Their bed, apparently, shared from now on. It still didn't feel entirely real. She reached up, brushing a bit of hair from her face. He watched her fingers quietly, curiously, as if trying to learn how she moved, how she carried herself. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, voice still low. "Well enough," she said. "You snore." He laughed, just a breath, but it made his chest rise and fall. "Only when I drink too much. You drank enough for 3 men. Then I'm glad I only snored." She smiled again. He was teasing, gently, testing her. She liked that he didn't try too hard. He propped himself on one elbow now, the blanket falling away from his shoulder. His tunic was bunched up near his waist, and he made no move to fix it. She could see a faint scar just below his collarbone. Not the kind earned in battle, but something else, an old wound, perhaps, or a boyhood accident. "Does it hurt?" she asked, nodding toward it. "This," he looked down. "Not anymore. A goat did that when I was 12. I tried to ride it like a horse." She laughed softly, covering her mouth with her hand. He grinned. "You can laugh louder if you want. No one else is awake." She didn't answer. But she let the laugh come anyway. A little louder, a little easier. They lay back again, side by side. After a moment, he turned his head toward her again. "I didn't know what to say last night," he admitted. "Neither did I. I thought maybe you hated me." She blinked. "Why would I? You were very quiet. So were you." "I was trying not to spill the mead," she snorted. "That's a good reason." They both smiled again. Outside, faint light began to stretch beneath the door, slats just, a glimmer of morning creeping in. The coals in the hearth cracked quietly. Somewhere near the doorway, a chicken made a confused, half-hearted cluck. He stretched, his arm brushing hers, and they both paused. He looked down at their hands, close but not quite touching. Then slowly, giving her time, he shifted his fingers so they rested lightly against hers. She didn't pull away. His thumb rubbed gently over the back of her hand, and she looked up at him again. "I don't know what kind of husband I'll be," he said honestly. She studied him. "You don't have to know yet." There was silence. Not heavy, not strange. Just the kind of silence that holds warmth, like wool soaking up sunlight. "Do you want to go back to sleep?" he asked after a while. She considered it. Not really. Me neither. They stayed there a little longer, watching the beams of sunlight slowly grow. The world would be awake soon. There would be porridge and chores and cousins barging in with loud voices and louder opinions. There would be wood to chop and animals to feed, but not yet. Right now, there was just the warmth of a shared blanket, the soft hush of morning, the slow breath of someone learning how to be near someone else. She looked at him. He looked at her. She reached out, tucked a piece of his hair behind his ear. He didn't move, and when she laid her head against his chest a moment later, he placed his hand lightly over her shoulder and let out a slow, contented sigh. The longhouse was quiet again. The porridge was already cold. Of course it was. The fire had barely been stirred this morning, and no one in the longhouse had the energy to warm anything yet. The wedding feast had left everyone heavy and sluggish. Even the chickens hadn't started fussing. Somewhere, someone's uncle snored under a fur cloak. A dog scratched lazily at a flea. He handed her the bowl with both hands. It was wooden, carved with little notches around the rim. The kind of thing a man might make on a winter night, sitting by the fire, half distracted and half dreaming. It wasn't beautiful, exactly, but it was well made, worn in but clean. He'd taken care with it. She took it from him without a word, nodding slightly in thanks. Then he sat down beside her on the edge of the sleeping platform, holding his own bowl in one hand and a spoon in the other. He didn't eat right away, just sat there, glancing toward her now and then out of the corner of his eye. The air between them was still new, still unsure, still full of things they hadn't yet said and weren't quite sure how to. She dipped her spoon into the porridge, thick, lumpy, too many barley grains, not enough honey. She blinked down at it, poked it gently. It jiggled slightly in the bowl. He looked over at her and opened his mouth, then closed it again. She caught him trying and failing not to watch her eat. After another long pause, he finally muttered, "I think this might actually be wall paste." She looked at him, surprised. His ears turned slightly pink. "You know," he added quickly, "if we had walls made of oats and sadness." A small, startled laugh escaped her lips. Not a polite laugh, not a social laugh, a real one. She looked down again, then up at him, and shook her head slowly. "Oats and sadness. I'll remember that." He shrugged. You don't have to. It's not a very good recipe. Another smile broke across her face, slower this time. She scooped up a spoonful and took a bite, chewing carefully. I think you're right. It tastes like heartbreak and firewood. He grinned. Their eyes met, longer this time. No awkwardness, just a shared warmth. A small spark in the dim light of the longhouse morning. For a moment, she forgot that they were newly married. That they'd barely spoken yesterday outside of ceremonial words and toasts. That their entire future had just been tied together in front of half the village. She forgot the weight of it all, and he forgot how nervous he'd been when she walked down the aisle in that blue dress. Forgot how many times he'd rehearsed saying her name the right way. Forgot that he didn't know if she liked goats or hated them. Right now, there were only two people, and two very bad bowls of porridge. He glanced down at his spoon, stirred. The porridge absently. I think there's a raisin in mine. She leaned closer, peering into his bowl. Where there, that dark thing, that's not a raisin, she said. That's burnt barley. He poked it with his spoon. It didn't move. It's judging me. She laughed again more freely, now and nudged his shoulder gently with hers. It was the first time they'd touched that morning, apart from lying side by side under the covers. But this felt different, intentional. He glanced at her hand, resting beside his, close, but not quite touching. His fingers twitched. Then he looked up again and caught her watching him. The air between them settled, still warm, still full of things unsaid, but no longer heavy. I used to eat porridge by myself, he said after a while, voice quieter now. She looked at him. Always, he nodded. After my mother died, my father didn't cook much. I'd make it myself, burn it most days, eat it while walking to the river. She listened, no interruptions, just slow chewing and soft attention. I used to eat with my sisters, she said. 3 of them. One always spilled honey, one always sang while chewing, and one never ate anything unless she had dried berries. Berries, he said, looking down into the plain, grey porridge. That would be nice. She smiled faintly. We don't have berries, not unless that burnt barley changes its attitude. She laughed again, shaking her head. The morning light was brighter now. A soft beam of sunlight slid across the floor of the longhouse, cutting through the hanging herbs and driftwood charms swaying near the ceiling. Dust motes shimmered in the air. Someone across the room sneezed loudly. They both looked over, then looked back at each other. He leaned a little closer. Do you want the good news or the bad news? She raised an eyebrow. Bad first. We'll be eating this again tomorrow. She groaned. He continued. The good news is, I think I can sneak us a piece of leftover bread from the back shelf. You know where it is? He tapped his temple. I watched the bread tray like a hawk last night. Didn't even blink. You blinked. I saw, well, I blinked with purpose. They both smiled again and then grew quiet. Not a heavy quiet. Not an uncertain one. A soft, shared stillness. The kind that settles between people who are just beginning to know one another and beginning to like what they find. She ate a little more of the porridge, less bothered by its texture now he sipped from a cup of cool water, then looked down into his half-eaten bowl. Can I ask you something? He said gently. She nodded. Why did you say yes? To marrying me, I mean. She was quiet for a long time. Then she set the spoon down, turned toward him slightly, and answered slowly, because I saw how you spoke to the old woman by the river. Last spring, you carried her basket and didn't ask for anything in return. He blinked. You remember that? He asked, surprised. I do. He looked down again, trying to hide the smile curling at the edges of his mouth. And you? She asked. Why did you say yes? He didn't answer immediately. Then, he said, because your laugh made the goats stop chewing, and that's not easy to do. She laughed agonright on cue. They finished their porridge. Neither of them liked it, not really, but they ate all of it, and when they stood up to start the rest of the day, he offered her his hand, not dramatically, not formally, just gently, quietly, as if they'd been doing this forever, and she took it. The sun had risen higher now, warming the roof beams of the longhouse, casting golden light across the sleeping skins and hanging herbs. Most of the wedding guests had left, or were still sleepily gathering their things. Outside, someone was already chopping wood. The sound rang out in steady, unhurried rhythm. She was folding blankets when he spoke. I should warn you, he said, scratching the back of his neck. My hair is a bit of a disaster. She glanced over at him. He looked almost sheepish. His thick, sun-colored hair was tied back in a lopsided knot, with a few stubborn braids sticking out in strange directions, fraying at the ends. A bit, she said, arching an eyebrow. He sighed. It's been a long winter. She smirked, setting the blankets aside. How long has it been since you actually washed it? He hesitated. Define washed. She gave him a look. I rinse it. When it rains, he offered, as if that would help. She shook her head, walked to her dowry chest, and began rummaging through it. No, that won't do. Come on, he frowned. Come where? To the stream. He blinked now. She turned, holding up a small jar of lavender oil and a horn comb. Yes, before I lose the nerve. He opened his mouth to protest but said nothing, just grabbed a cloak and followed her outside, still looking faintly puzzled. The path to the stream was short, winding through the edge of the woods where last year's leaves still clung to the edges of the trail. Birds chirped lazily above them. The breeze was cool, but not biting. She walked slightly ahead, confident, carrying the comb and oil like she was preparing for a battle she fully expected to win. He walked behind, hand resting on the back of his neck, as if already anticipating embarrassment. When they reached the stream, the water sparkled in the sunlight, cold, clear and brisk. A few stones jutted out near the edge, where someone had once built a washing platform from old logs. She knelt beside it and gestured for him to sit. He hesitated. She raised an eyebrow. It's just hair. He sat. She pulled off his cloak and gently unfastened the leather cord holding his braids together. A tumble of thick golden strands fell around his shoulders. Wow, she said softly. He turned his head. What? She ran her fingers through the ends. There's a twig in... Here are, he said. I wondered where that went. She chuckled, and possibly some breadcrumbs. He groaned. I eat over firewood a lot. Things happen. She dipped a cloth into the stream and wrung it out. Well, we're going to fix it. The water was cold against his scalp, and he flinched a little. She leaned closer. Don't be dramatic. It's just water. It's glacial. You'll live. She worked gently, soaking the ends, then the middle, then the roots. She poured a few drops of lavender oil into her palms and rubbed it in slowly, massaging it into the strands and scalp. His shoulders relaxed. His breath slowed. You don't have to be so careful, he murmured. I want to. The stream burbled softly beside them. The breeze rustled in the leaves. Every now and then, she'd find a knot and pause to untangle it, her fingers working. Slowly, patiently, always brushing lightly against his neck, he tilted his head slightly to the side, eyes half closed. "Why lavender?" he asked after a while. "My mother always used it," she said. "Before feast days, she said it made people behave better." He smiled faintly. "Do you think it'll work on me? We'll see." She began combing, then starting from the bottom and working up, carefully drawing the horn comb through the softened tangles. She didn't rush. He didn't speak. He just sat still, letting her touch undo the winter's worth of mess and knots and quiet neglect. "You have very thick hair," she said quietly. "My mother said it was the one thing I got from her." "It's beautiful," she said, before she could stop herself. He turned slightly, meeting her eyes over his shoulder. "You think so?" She nodded. "It suits you." He smiled again, small, a little shy. She returned to combing, and they fell into silence again. A silence that was soft, not empty. The kind of silence that stretches comfortably between two people who are no longer strangers. When she was done, she sat back and looked at her work. His hair now flowed neatly over his shoulders, clean and glistening, smelling faintly of lavender and early spring. He looked different, softer somehow, younger and yet older. He turned to face her. "You didn't have to do that, I know, but you did." She looked down, then back up. "You're my husband now." His expression shifted, surprise, warmth, something else. She added softly, "That still feels strange to say to me too." A moment passed. Then he reached out, very slowly, and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "Will you let me do yours one day?" he asked. She laughed, light and honest. "You'd make a mess of it, probably," he admitted, "but I'd try." "I might let you," she said, "if you promise to warm the water first. I'll build a fire right here on the bank." She smiled again. "That would defeat the purpose of the stream." He shrugged. "I'm new to this marriage thing. We both are." They sat beside the stream a little longer, the sun warming their backs, the scent of lavender curling between them like smoke. He leaned back on his elbows, hair drying in the breeze. She leaned beside him, close but not touching, a few inches of space between them. Not a wall, just space, ready to be crossed, ready to become something more. The water sang quietly. The birds called to each other in the trees, and though they didn't say it out loud, both of them knew this was a beginning. It was still early in the afternoon when she turned to him and said, very simply, "Come with me." She didn't say where, she didn't explain why. She just reached for her cloak, tied it at the shoulder, and looked over her shoulder with a smile that wasn't quite a smile, but something softer. He blinked at her from across the yard. "Now?" She nodded. So he pulled on his boots, wrapped a thin wool tunic around his shoulders, and followed. They walked in silence for the first stretch of the path, past the animal pens, past the fading fire pit where someone had left a scorched ladle stuck in a cracked pot, past a willow tree where two boys were half-heartedly tossing pebbles into a bucket. She didn't speak. He didn't press her. She seemed to know where she was going, and he was happy to follow. Not just because he didn't have anything better to do, but because there was something in her step to daylight, but purposeful, that made him curious. It was the way she kept glancing at the horizon, like she had a secret waiting there. The breeze picked up as they moved farther from the longhouse. It tugged gently at her veil, lifting the edge like a whisper. She didn't adjust it, didn't mind it. Her cheeks were slightly flushed from the walk, but she didn't slow down. He caught up beside her. "Are you stealing me away?" he asked softly. She smiled without looking at him. "Maybe. I didn't know wives were allowed to steal husbands." "We're allowed. Just quiet about it." They passed a cluster of birch trees, their pale trunks dancing in the wind. The path narrowed, then opened again into a grassy slope, one he hadn't noticed before. At the top was a small hill, not steep, not dramatic, but high enough to see the whole valley beyond. She led him to the top, where the grass was short and warm from the sun. Wildflowers dotted the ground, tiny blue ones, and pale yellow buds no bigger than a fingernail. A single flat stone jutted from the hilltop like a lazy seat, half buried in weather dash smoothed. She sat on it. He stayed standing for a moment, taking it in. Below them, the village curved along the river bend like a loose braid. Smoke curled from chimneys, blending into the pale sky. Boats bobbed near the shore. Chickens pecked at the edge of the grain field, looking like moving dots from this height. He sat beside her, their shoulders nearly touching. "You used to come here?" he asked. She nodded. "Before, when I wanted to be alone." He turned to her. "And now you brought me." She glanced at him, one corner of her mouth rising. "You're quieter than I expected. You don't fill silence just to fill it." "I don't mind quiet," he said. "Neither do one." A pause. Then, with a small grin, he pulled a folded cloth from his satchel and unwrapped it to reveal 2 small pieces of cheese, just slightly dry around the edge of sand, a corked flask. Her eyes widened. He handed her one of the cheese pieces. "A feast fit for royalty." She laughed. "You packed snacks." "Well," he said, mock serious, "you didn't say how long the kidnapping would last." She took the cheese, smiling. "You're very prepared." "I live with my brother. I've learned to hide food." "And this?" she asked, lifting the flask. "Mead, watered down, unless you want to fall asleep mid-sunset." She uncorked it, sniffed, and nodded approvingly. Wise. They ate slowly, the cheese a little salty, the mead just sweet enough. The sun was warm on their backs. The grass bent and rustled around them. A bird wheeled overhead in a lazy arc. "So," he said after a while, "what did you think about when you came here alone?" She chewed thoughtfully. "All sorts of things. What I'd do if I never got married. What I'd do if I got married too young. Whether goats have feelings," he laughed. "Do they? They seem to hold grudges." "That's true." She turned to him. "What about you? What did you dream of?" He looked out over the valley. "I wanted to build a boat and sail somewhere warm. Somewhere I wouldn't need 3 layers of wool to sleep." She studied him quietly. "Did you ever build one?" she asked. He shook his head. "No. Just helped mend others. Never had the time or the nerve." She nodded. "Maybe you will. Maybe." They sat in silence again, not awkward, just easy. The wind tousled his hair clean now, brushed and free of knots. It shimmered in the light as he leaned back on his hands. She leaned back too, her veil blowing fully off her shoulder now. She didn't fix it. His gaze drifted to her profile, the curve of her cheek, the slight furrow in her brow as she looked at the sky. "I used to imagine," she said softly, "that this hill was mine, like I'd claimed it, like if I stood on it long enough, I'd understand everything. And do you?" "No," she said, "but I like how quiet it is when I try." He smiled. Then he said, after a long breath, "I'm glad you brought me." She didn't answer right away. Then she looked at him and said, So am I. He reached out without thinking and tucked a piece of hair behind her ear. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, she looked at him with steady eyes, unreadable at first, then softening. The sun was low now, just brushing the tops of the far trees. Shadows grew longer across the grass. The mead flask was empty. Neither of them moved. He thought about saying something, but he didn't want to ruin the quiet. So he just sat there, letting the space between them close by inches. And when her hand brushed his, as she leaned back onto her elbow, he turned his palm upward, inviting. She slipped her fingers into his. Their hands stayed there, loosely laced. They didn't talk after that. They just watched the sky turn from pale blue to gold, then to dusky rose, the sun dipping lower with every quiet breath. At some point, he looked over and whispered, "Do you want to go back?" She shook her head, still watching the clouds. Not yet, so they stayed. Two people on a hill, two hands joined in the soft hush of wind and wildflowers, two hearts beating just a little closer than before. And beneath them, the village drifted into evening like a dream. The day began like any other. The rooster crowed far too early, the hearth was cold and grumpy, and someone's goat had wandered into the vegetable garden again. She was kneeling beside the fire pit, coaxing the coals back to life when he came. In, from outside hair, tousled arms full of damp firewood, a few specks of bark stuck to his tunic. "You're awake early," she said, brushing soot from her fingers. He shrugged, smiling. Didn't want the wind to steal all the dry wood. "It's going to rain, I think." He was right. The sky had that heavy, iron-colored look, the kind that promised slow, cold drizzle by mid-morning. She reached up to take a few logs from him. Their fingers touched just briefly, but he didn't flinch anymore. Nor did she. The fire hissed as he set the wood down. It caught quickly. The warmth filled the longhouse in steady waves, pushing away the lingering bite of night. Later, after porridge and half a loaf of bread between them, he pulled on his thickest cloak. "I'll walk down to the dock," he said. "Help Arn patch the boat before the tide rises." She nodded, brushing crumbs off the table. "Tell him not to use that crooked plank again. It won't hold." He grinned. "You're becoming a boatwife already." She lifted an eyebrow. "Is that a compliment?" The highest, and with a soft laugh, he ducked through the door and was gone. What happened next wasn't meant to be memorable. Not by him, at least. He had just stepped out into the grey air, head down against the wind, cloak snapping behind him, when old Carryhoo seemed to appear everywhere like a spirit of gossip, and pickled turnip shuffled past with her woven basket. Her eyes narrowed, as they always did when she saw him. "You're out early," she said. He smiled politely. My wife says it'll rain." He said it without pause. No hesitation. Just like someone might say my boots or my axe. A fact. A part of him. But Caris's ears were sharp, and her smirk sharper. "Your wife, is it?" she said. Her tone like a needle in wool. That didn't take long. He flushed slightly. "We've been married a week." "Still counts," she said, and hobbled off with a grin. He didn't think anything of it at the time. But inside the house, just a few steps away, she had heard. The door had been cracked open to let the smoke out, and his voice had floated in. On the wind, soft but clear. "My wife says it'll rain." The words caught her mid-motion, her hands stilling above the wash basin. A single drop of water slipped from her knuckle and landed in the soap with a quiet plop. "My wife," he hadn't said it like a stranger trying on a new name. He hadn't stumbled. He hadn't laughed. He had just ... said it. And in that moment, the word curled around her like something warm, unexpected, delicate, real. She felt the blush start in her chest and rise slowly to her cheeks. She sat down on the edge of the bed, still holding the wet cloth. A tiny smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. He didn't mention it when he came home that afternoon. Dripping and wind-blown and muttering about warped planks and stubborn nails. She didn't mention it either, but the air between them felt different, quieter, more aware. That night, the storm came. Rain tapped against the roof like soft fingers. Wind howled through the shutters. The longhouse creaked in protest. They sat near the fire, wrapped in the same wool blanket, sharing the end of a dried apple slice and pretending not to watch each other too closely. The flames flickered on the walls. Their shadows leaned together, danced apart, leaned again. She watched the fire for a long time before speaking. "You called me your wife today," she said softly. He turned to her, startled. "Did I?" She nodded to Carrie. He looked slightly horrified. Gods, did she tell the whole village yet? "Probably," she said. "But that's not what I meant." He hesitated. "Then what did you mean?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned to face him fully. Her fingers found the edge of his sleeve, played with it. "You said it like it was normal," she whispered. He stared at her, and then, very slowly, his hand covered hers. "It felt normal," he said. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It felt like the pause after something important when the world holds its breath. Then, quietly, she said, "Good night, husband." The word hung between them like firelight. His breath caught. It was the first time she'd said it. She didn't say it jokingly. Didn't say it in passing. She meant it. His fingers tightened slightly around hers. "Say it again," she smiled. "Husband," he smiled back. "Wife." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for a long time, neither of them moved. The fire cracked softly. Rain whispered across the thatch dot outside. The village slept inside. Two people sat wrapped in wool and names that, just 1 week ago, had felt like costumes. But now they fit like skin. It was one of those early spring evenings when the wind bites harder than it should. The longhouse had been warm earlier, bustling with chatter, clatter of bowls, and the smell of salted fish roasting on a spit butt now, with the fire slowly burning down and darkness settling outside like damp wool. The chill crept in through the cracks. She rubbed her hands together, then held them close to the fading embers. He watched her from across the hearth, frowning slightly. "You're cold," he said, not as a question. She gave a soft smile. "I'll live." He stood, disappearing into the rear alcove of the longhouse where their belongings were piled in neat, uneven stacks. He rummaged through a chest, then returned a moment later, holding a heavy, folded blanket the color of stormy sea. "This one's better than the others," he said. "Thicker. My sister and I wove it together before your last year." She took it in her hands. It was warm already from the place it had been stored, and smelled faintly of pine and wool grease. "You and your sister made this?" she asked, gently tracing the edge. He nodded. "Mostly her. I'm still terrible at the edges. Look, see here." She turned the corner in her lap and smiled. "It's crooked, exactly. I wanted to fix it, but she said it made the blanket more charming." She was right. He sat beside her, and for a moment they simply looked at the fire in silence. Then, without a word, he reached out tentatively and pulled the blanket across both their shoulders. It was an awkward motion, a little clumsy, It tugged too far. To one side at first, and she had to scoot an inch closer. But they adjusted together, like people learning a shared rhythm. Soon, the wool was draped across both of them, tugged up to their chins, and gathered loosely around their backs. Their arms touched. Their legs nearly did. Her head hovered near his shoulder, unsure. He held perfectly still, and then she leaned in. It was not a dramatic gesture. She didn't fling herself into his arms, or sigh like the heroines in traveling sagas. She just let her head rest lightly on his shoulder, her temple against the edge of his neck. It was the first time she'd done it, and it undid him completely. He stopped breathing for half a moment. His thoughts went absolutely silent, like a forest blanketed in snow. She said nothing, neither did he. His heart, however, was loud enough to hear. They sat that way for a long time, the only sound being the occasional pop from the hearth. Somewhere outside, a goat made a pitiful sound, possibly from a dream or indigestion. They both smiled, but didn't move. She shifted once to adjust the blanket and tuck her feet beneath her skirt. When she did, her shoulder brushed more closely into his chest. He held still again. "You're very warm," she said softly. "So are you." She smiled into the firelight. "Did your sister teach you how to weave, or just drag you into it?" "Both," he said. "She said a man should be able to feed himself, clothe himself, and repair a tear without calling for his mother. Wise woman. She also said I should marry someone who won't laugh when I burn the stew." Now she laughed. It wasn't loud, more like a slow, warm bubbling up in her chest that reached her eyes. He turned toward her carefully, so as not to dislodge her head from his shoulder, and looked at her properly. "I'm glad you're not laughing," he said. "I'm not laughing at you," she replied. "Just around you." He blinked. "Is that better?" "I think so." They both smiled. After a while, she closed her eyes. The fire dimmed into soft red coals. He stared into the glow, watching the shadows shift across the floorboards. Then, very softly, he said, "Is this what it's supposed to feel like?" She stirred. "What? Marriage?" "I thought it would feel bigger, stranger, like wearing someone else's boots." She opened her eyes. "And what does it feel like now?" He looked down at the top of her head. Her braid had loosened slightly. At the end, one lock of hair had slipped out and curled against her cheek. "It feels like you," he said. She tilted her head, smiling. "And what does that feel like?" He hesitated. Then, like the warm side of the blanket, her smile grew wider. "Say that again," she whispered. He blushed. "No, once was enough." She leaned closer, the side of her face fully pressed to his chest now. Her hands slid under the blanket and wrapped loosely around his arm. "You say the strangest things," she murmured, eyes closing again. He swallowed. "Sorry, I didn't say I minded." He didn't move. Just let her stay like that. He was afraid that if he shifted, or even breathed too loudly, she might pull away. And he wasn't quite ready for that, so he sat still, perfectly still, while her fingers rested lightly against his wrist. And when her breathing deepened and softened, he realized she had fallen asleep there, half wrapped in wool, and half in him. The fire dimmed further. He adjusted the blanket just enough to keep her covered, then rested his cheek lightly against her hair. His arm had gone numb. His leg was cramped, and his back was starting to ache from the awkward position. But he didn't move. Not yet. Some things were worth the ache. The market was nearly empty by mid-morning. The rain from the night before had left the dirt roads sticky and the air filled with the smell of wet wood, herbs, and slightly damp wool. A few stubborn vendors had set up beneath sagging canvas awnings, their goods displayed in lopsided rows of baskets and cloths. She had insisted on going, despite the weather. He didn't argue. He'd learned quickly that she was not the sort of woman who let weather dictate her day. They walked side by side, not too close, but not far either. Occasionally, their elbows would bump, and neither of them apologized. The market itself was quiet, just a handful of locals, muttering about onions or arguing over the price of smoked fish. A goose flapped indignantly in a wicker pen. A child ran by with a stolen apple, and there, right in the middle of the road, stood a goat. A ridiculous goat. Its horns were slightly lopsided. One ear flopped over in a way that gave it a permanent look of mild surprise, and its beard was covered in burrs from some unfortunate bush. She stared at it. He followed her gaze, and then quietly, without meaning to, she said, "That goat looks like my cousin Eirik." He blinked. Then, after a beat, chuckled. "Eirik has a better beard," he replied. She smiled, only just. The goat bleated, turned around, and proceeded to eat a corner of someone's cloak. She laughed, not a small laugh this time, but a proper, bubbling laugh that made her tilt her head back just slightly, eyes crinkling with amusement. He watched her, amused by her amusement. He liked that about her, how easily she found things funny, how unguarded she became in moments like this. They passed by the goat and continued walking. The sun had begun to break through the clouds, casting soft gold across the puddled earth. The wet leaves overhead glittered. She tugged her shawl tighter around her shoulders and stepped over a puddle, carefully, like she'd done it 100 times. And then, without warning, without fanfare, her hand reached out and found his dot. Just like that, her fingers slid between. His light at first, unsure, as if she hadn't even noticed she was doing it. He noticed everything. The softness of her hand, calloused slightly from embroidery and weaving. The warmth of her skin despite the cool air. The way her thumb curled just a little against his. But he didn't look down, didn't say a word. He just tightened his fingers around hers in reply, firm, certain, and kept walking. Their pace slowed a little, unconsciously. The path home was quiet. A few chickens clucked in the distance, and somewhere, someone was hammering roof tiles into place. But the world had softened. She didn't let go, and neither did he. They passed a fence, where the early spring shoots of cabbage were just beginning to peek through. She pointed them out with her free hand. "My mother used to say cabbages grow best when they're ignored," she said. "That explains my uncle's personality," he replied. She grinned. Was he raised by vegetables? More or less. She squeezed his hand. At one point, they had to climb over a narrow wooden stile. He climbed first, then turned and offered his hand again. This time, she took it without hesitation. She didn't need help, not really, but she took it anyway, and he didn't let go once she was down. They simply kept walking, hands still joined. By the time they reached the edge of the village, the sun had fully broken through. Birds chirped. The goat had somehow followed them. Halfway home, before being distracted by a low-hanging branch, she stopped. He stopped beside her. She looked down at their joined hands, then up at him. He raised an eyebrow as if to ask, was it on purpose? She looked thoughtful for a moment, then said, "I think I forgot I was holding it." He smiled slowly. Should I let go? She thought again. Shook her head no. So he didn't. They kept walking. Later, as they stepped into the longhouse and shook the dust from their cloaks, he noticed something strange. He missed the feel of her hand the moment. It left his dot, it had fit there just right. And even as they went about the rest of the afternoon, dividing bread, salting fish, folding wool, he could still feel the ghost of her fingers curled around his. That night, when they lay down to sleep beneath the same blanket as always, he reached out first, and this time, she was the one who tightened her grip. No words needed. The hearth fire had long since burned to embers. The longhouse was still, thick with the silence that only deep night can bring, when even the chickens stop stirring and the goats lie quiet in their pens. The only sound was the faint whistle of wind through the thatch roof, and the occasional creak of settling wood beams above. She was awake. Not wide awake dash, just ... quietly alert. That restless kind of wakefulness where the body is still, but the mind has wandered off on its own. She lay on her back beneath the fur blanket, staring at the wooden beams above, listening to the small rhythm of his breathing beside her. Then she felt it, a shift. The smallest movement, he was awake too. Without a word, she turned her head toward him. He was already looking at her. In the half-darkness, their eyes met. Neither said anything at first. There was no need to. After a while, he reached toward the shelf by their bed, fumbling gently. A soft click of flint, a quiet breath as the wick caught, and suddenly there was light. A single beeswax candle flickered to life, its golden glow spilling over the woolen blanket, the folds of her night shift, the quiet curve of his collarbone. They sat up slowly, careful not to wake the rest of the longhouse. The world felt smaller in that moment, reduced to the square of blanket, the soft candlelight, and each other. Her legs folded under her, his stretched out beside hers. Their knees touched under the covers, but neither moved. "What time is it?" she asked, her voice no louder than a thought. He glanced toward the slatted window, though it told him nothing. "Still night," he murmured, "but not much of it." "Left," she nodded, as if that made perfect sense. There was a silence between them, not uncomfortable, not empty, just quiet. Then, after a moment, she said, "I dreamt of home." He tilted his head. "My mother's hearth," she continued. "The smell of stew and boiled herbs. I haven't thought about that kitchen in moons, but tonight it was so clear I could taste the turnips." He smiled. "Did you miss it?" She thought for a moment. "No," she said softly, "just remembered it." He nodded. That made sense. "Too. I used to sneak bread from my mother's kitchen," he said, "late at night when she thought I was asleep. She always knew, though pretended not to." "Did she say anything?" "Only once. I found a note beside the bread that said, 'Next time, take the cheese, too. You'll be hungrier than you think.'" She laughed quietly. He watched her in the candlelight. The shadows made her eyes look darker, deeper. Her lips curved softly, like the edge of a seashell. She caught him staring and arched a brow. "What? Nothing." She smiled. "You were definitely thinking something." He hesitated, then said, "I like seeing you like this." She tilted her head. "Like what?" "Lit by candlelight. Awake when the rest of the world isn't." She didn't answer right away, just looked down at their hands, resting side by side on the blanket. Then she shifted slightly, so that her fingers touched his. Not laced together. Not quite. just touching. It was enough. I used to think, she said, that marriage would feel like something louder, bigger, like thunder or feasting or shouting across a field. He listened, but this, she said, waking up in the middle of the night to talk about bread and turnips. I think I like this better. He nodded. So do I. The candle flickered. A draft of wind slipped through the wall and made the flame dance wildly before settling again. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Without asking, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His hand lingered just, slightly brushing her cheek. Neither of them moved away. "Do you miss being alone?" she asked suddenly. He looked at her, surprised. "Why?" "Because I do, sometimes." She looked down, sheepish. "Is that awful to say?" "No," he said gently. "It's honest." She exhaled, relieved. He added, "I miss it too, but less than I thought I would." She looked up at him. "That first morning," he said, "when we woke up side by side, I kept thinking, I hope this doesn't feel strange tomorrow." "And did it?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, it just felt warmer." The candle had burned halfway down now. The room smelled faintly of melted wax and old pine. Somewhere outside, an owl hooted. She laid her head against his shoulder without thinking. He didn't stiffen, didn't shift. Just let her rest there, warm and sleepy. They didn't speak for a while. They didn't need to. Eventually, she said, "This is the kind of moment I won't remember later." He looked down at her. "Why not?" "Because nothing happened." Important words, no big promises, just ... A candle and some soft talk. He thought about that, then said, "Maybe those are the moments we carry without noticing." She smiled like stones in a pocket. He nodded. Exactly. They stayed like that a little longer, letting the warmth of each other seep into their skin, into their quiet thoughts. Finally, when the candle had nearly burned out, he blew it gently, and the room returned to darkness. But the darkness didn't feel empty. It felt full with everything unspoken, everything understood. They laid back down, their bodies a little closer now, their hands finding each other beneath the blanket, and though the rest of the night passed quietly, something had shifted. Not loudly, not with thunder, just a small, sure flame in the dark. The longhouse was quiet, not the kind of quiet that came with nightfall or sleeping children or simmering stew. This was a deeper quiet, the kind of silence that follows after many footsteps have left and the air is no longer full of voices. The in-laws were gone. His father had slapped him on the shoulder and said something vague about firewood. His mother had kissed her cheek and whispered, "You'll be fine. Just remember to feed him well." The cousins had packed up their carts, their children, their leftover salted meat. Someone had forgotten a wooden spoon. No one cared now, it was just them. She stood in the middle of the room, barefoot, her sleeves rolled up from washing mugs. A small curl of hair had slipped loose from her braid and stuck to her cheek. She didn't notice. She was too busy listening to the silence. He stood a few feet away, holding a half-folded blanket in his arms. They looked at each other, then looked around. No chickens underfoot. No laughter outside. No laughter outside. No noisy stories about so-and-so's cow falling into the river again. Only stillness, I think. He said slowly, "They're really gone." She nodded. "I think so too." They both laughed softly, a strange, relieved sort of laugh. He dropped the blanket onto the bench and walked to her. "It's just us now," he said. Her eyes twinkled. Are you sure you can survive without your uncle's snoring next to the fire? Barely, he said. I was growing fond of the rhythm. They both grinned, then neither of them moved. The silence stretched, warm and comfortable now, like an old wool tunic that finally fit just right. I don't know what to do with all this quiet, she said, turning in a slow circle. It's like the house is listening. He raised an eyebrow. Maybe it is. To what? He walked to the hearth, where ashes from the morning fire still sat warm. Us, she walked to him slowly. Her feet padded softly across the wooden floor, leaving invisible prints. Well, she said thoughtfully, then we should give it something worth listening to. He turned to face her. Like what? She smiled and held out her hand. Dance with me, she said. He looked at her hand, then back at her face. There's no music, we don't need it. He hesitated only for a second and then took her hand. It was cool and warm at the same time. Familiar now, in a way it hadn't been even a week ago. He liked the way her fingers curled around his not tight. Just certain, they stepped into the open space between the hearth and the sleeping area. The room was not large, but it was enough. He placed one hand on her waist, awkwardly at first. She guided it higher with a soft touch. There, she said, better. Her other hand rested lightly on his shoulder. She looked up at him, her eyes half-lidded, waiting. And so they danced, not gracefully, not in time with anything but their own slow heartbeats. His steps were too wide, hers were too light. They bumped into the bench, laughed, and kept going. She hummed a melody under her breath, one he didn't know, but instantly liked. He leaned closer to hear it. You made that up, he asked. Maybe, it's lovely. The light through the slatted windows had turned golden now, that late afternoon hue that softens even the dust in the air. It glinted off her cheek, the curve of her neck, the silver pin at her collar. He looked at her like he'd never really looked before, not just at her, but into her, and she noticed. I used to come here when I was small, she whispered. Before. It was ours. I always wondered who would live here after the wedding. He smiled. Did you imagine someone different? She tilted her head, thinking, I imagined someone taller. He gasped in mock betrayal. You wound me. She laughed and leaned her head against his chest, and he stopped dancing just for a moment to hold her. The room stayed silent, save for their breathing in, out, the sound of shared air. After a while, she pulled back just enough to look. At him, we should name it, the house. She nodded. It's ours now. It should have a name. He looked around. What should we call it? She turned in place, her hand still in his. Something soft. He thought for a moment. What about ... Stillness Hall? She smiled, too serious. He shrugged. Goose Cottage, she burst out laughing. Why on earth? You walk like a goose when you're angry. She punched his arm gently. They laughed again. Eventually, they decided on no name at all. The house, it seemed, would name itself in time. For now, it was just home. And that was enough. They danced until the sun dipped behind the trees and the light turned amber, then purple, then blue. They danced until their feet hurt and their arms ached and their cheeks were warm from smiling too long. Then they sat on the floor, backs against the wall, legs tangled like roots. She leaned her head on his shoulder and said, I hope no one visits tomorrow. He nodded. They won't. How? Do you know? Because I'm locking the door. The fire was built again that evening. Just the two of them, kneeling side by side, feeding, kindling, and blowing gently. No one interrupted. No one asked for more salt or spilled beer on the floor. They ate by candlelight, bare feet tucked under fur, no need for shoes or ceremony. After the meal, he found her spinning wool in the corner. He sat beside her and watched, content just to be there. "You're staring," she said. Double quotes, "Yes. Why, I like how quiet you are." She paused in her spinning, smiled. "That's the nicest thing anyone said to me today." Later, when the fire had burned low and they lay curled beneath the blanket, he whispered, "Did today feel different to you?" She didn't open her eyes. Yes, in a good way. In the only way that matters. And so, their house didn't echo anymore. Not with footsteps, not with chatter, but with a kind of quiet that filled the bones, that made space feel warmer, and ordinary things like spinning wool or mismatched dancing feel like small, holy rituals. For the first time, it was just them and the quiet. It had never sounded sweeter. The first crack of thunder was distant, just a low murmur over the hills, like a drum being tested far off in the trees inside the longhouse. It barely stirred the air. She was already beneath the woolen blankets, one arm draped over his waist, her cheek resting just below his collarbone. His chest rose and fell slowly beneath her, and every breath warmed her ear in a steady rhythm. It wasn't a rhythm she had known just days ago, and yet now it felt like a lullaby written only for her. Outside, the storm prepared itself. Inside, they were still. The hearth fire had been banked low, but it glowed softly in the corner of the room, casting amber shapes against the timber beams. The smell of juniper and smoke hung in the air leftovers from the evening stew, and the pine cones he'd thrown into the flames just to hear them pop. She murmured something he didn't catch. He tilted his head down, brushing his lips against her temple. What was that? She turned her face up toward his. Her voice was lazy and quiet. "I said, we should never light the hearth with wet pine cones again," he smiled. The sound was satisfying. The smell was terrible. "You're just jealous," I thought of it first. She smiled and nestled back into his chest. Another rumble rolled across the valley, this one closer. She didn't flinch, neither did he. The storm, after all, was outside. Out beyond the thatched roof and thick oak walls. Let the gods argue in the sky if they wanted to. Their little world, this bed, this room, this moment was untouched. It hadn't always been like this. Only a week ago, they'd slept facing opposite walls, careful not to let knees, brush, or fingers touch by accident. There had been politeness then, a mutual gentleness, but also nerves, hesitations, the kind of space that hovers between two people who don't quite know each other yet, but mean to now. The space was gone. Not because they had tried to fill it, but because it had simply melted. His hand moved, slowly up her back, fingers tracing the line of her spine through the thin linen of her night tunic. He did this without thinking, the same way one stokes a fire or hums without realizing. A quiet, automatic affection. She shifted just enough to kiss his chest. Not high enough for the heart, not low enough for the ribs. Just in that spot where breath lives. He looked down at her, comfy. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The wind began to rise. Not howling, but deliberate. A steady pressing against the shutters. Outside, the trees bent. The goats in the pen grumbled and settled down. The rain started not with a roar, but a hush, a tapping, a whispering on the roof. She pulled the blanket up over her shoulder. He wrapped both arms around her, cocooning them together like a nest of moss inside a hollowed log. "I always liked storms," she said softly. "When I was small, I used to crawl under the wool pile and pretend I was in a cave." He chuckled. "A cave, a warm one, with glowing rocks, and no wolves." He kissed the crown of her head. "You're in a cave now, you know, sort of." She smiled sleepily. "A warm one, the warmest, and no wolves, only me." She looked up, grinning. "You, a wolf." He growled playfully. Then they both laughed so hard the blanket nearly slid off the bed. After the laughter faded, the silence came. But this time, it was different. Not awkward, not even particularly quiet, but full of breathing and warmth, and the sense that sleep was drawing close. She yawned and nestled in again. He closed his eyes. Outside, the wind shifted direction. The shutters creaked. The rain danced harder, now tapping a rhythm against the rooftop, like ancient fingers drumming on a shield. Inside, nothing moved. He was almost asleep when she spoke. "Again, do you think it'll always feel like this?" He opened his eyes. "Like what? This, us, like there's no edge between where you stop and I begin." He thought for a moment. "I hope so," he said. "Me too." She reached down and twined their legs together under the blanket. A perfect fit. Then, softly, she added, "I was afraid. When, before the wedding, I didn't say anything. But I was afraid I'd feel trapped." He opened his eyes again, fully this time. "And now," she shifted, "now I don't feel trapped at all. I feel..." She trailed off. He didn't push her to finish, but after a long moment, she said it anyway. "I feel found." He didn't reply with words. He just held her a little tighter, and she knew he understood. The fire in the hearth had nearly died now. Only the faintest ember glowed beneath the blackened logs. But they didn't rise to feed it. Didn't move at all. They didn't need to. There was nothing more to say. Nothing more to plan or prove or promise. Not tonight, because tonight had ended the way all good days should end. In silence, in safety, in skin-to-skin stillness. Her breathing slowed. So did his, somewhere outside. A tree branch cracked inside. They slept on Dot together. The marriage had only just begun, but already the storm could knock and they would not move. Not because they were brave, but because they were loved, and wrapped in that. Even thunder cannot shake the walls. The morning began slow, as most mornings did now. No one pounded on the longhouse door. No neighbors came with news of goats gone missing. No parents arrived with baskets or opinions. Just the soft golden spill of light across the floorboards, and the muted coo of a nesting dove outside the shutter. She stretched with a low groan and pulled the woolen blanket up under her chin. He was already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed, tying the leather thong round his boot with the quiet focus of someone who had nothing urgent to do and nowhere else he'd rather be. She rolled onto her stomach, her hair spilling round her like dark honey. "What are you doing?" "Trying to remember if I'm supposed to sharpen the hoe or the spade today." "Or," she said lazily, "you could help with something more difficult." He looked back at her, eyes narrowed in mock suspicion, such as... She sat up slowly and turned her back toward him. Her hair tumbled past her shoulders, thick and slightly tangled from sleep. "Braid this properly." He blinked, seriously. She glanced over her shoulder, arching one brow. "Scared?" "No," he said quickly. Then, more honestly, terrified. They sat in the light near the hearth, knees touching. She combed her fingers through the worst knots while he fetched her carved wooden comb from her dowry chest. He held it like it was an ancient artifact. "I've watched you do this 100 times, he said. "Yes, but watching and doing are not the same. This is not firewood. You don't just bundle it and chop." He made a face, encouraging. She smiled and handed him the comb. The first few strokes were cautious. He started too gently, barely grazing the surface, as if afraid to hurt her. She sighed and said, "You're not stirring soup. Press a little." He did, a bit too hard. "Oh, sorry. Not soup, not sword. Something in between." He muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like a prayer to Thor. Eventually, the comb glided more smoothly. She sat still, eyes closed, trusting him. Her breathing slowed. The longhouse was quiet, save for the occasional crackle of the hearth and the wind outside nudging the door. And then came the part he'd truly dreaded, the actual braiding. 3 sections, left over center. Right over center, or was it left under? He stared at the strands in his hands like they were sea serpents. "You can do this," she said softly, sensing his hesitation. "I'd rather fight off 3 berserkers and a hungry goose," she smiled, but stayed silent. So he began. His fingers fumbled. The strands slipped. At one point he tied it backward, realized it, and gently unraveled. She didn't scold, just waited, calm, patient, her trust a quiet encouragement. And then slowly it began to look like a braid, crooked, lumpy in parts, a bit uneven, but definitely a braid. He tied it at the end with a strip of leather and sat back with a deep sigh. Done. She reached back to feel it, ran her fingers along the weave. She didn't say anything right away, and he braced himself for laughter. But when she finally turned to look at him, her face was warm. "This," she said, "is the best braid I've worn." He blinked. "Really? It's uneven, a bit crooked." He winced. "But it's mine, and you did it. So yes, really." She wore it the rest of the day, even to the market, even when her cousin snorted and said, "Did a bear do your hair?" She smiled and said, "No, my husband," and that was the end of the conversation. That night, just before bed, she undid the braid herself, strand by strand, gently unraveling what he had made. Her fingers were slower than usual, more careful. He watched from the bed. "You're undoing it, only so you can try again tomorrow," he grinned. "You sure you trust me with your hair again?" She glanced at him as she slipped under. "The blankets, more than I trust you with soup, and definitely more than I trust you with geese." He laughed, then leaned over and kissed her forehead. That night, she dreamed of nothing. Not storms, not wolves, not braids gone wrong, just warmth and hands in her hair, and a future slowly being woven, strand by loving strand. It was an ordinary day, the kind of day that didn't deserve to be remembered, at least not for the chores, or the weather, or anything anyone else would notice. He was chopping onions near the hearth, muttering to himself about why onions had to be so terror-inducing and slippery at the same time. She was weaving something at the loom, a small tunic for her cousin's newborn, counting threads with quiet concentration. Outside, the wind blew the early scent of spring-wet dirt, thawed moss, and the far-off promise of green things inside. Time moved gently. She She got up from the loom to check the pot simmering over the fire. He didn't hear her coming, just the soft footfall behind him, then the brief, familiar weight of her hand on his shoulder. That was all, just her fingertips, pressing lightly just enough to say, "I see you," without saying anything at all. And then she was gone, past him, bending over the stew pot, adjusting the lid, humming. To herself, like nothing had happened, but he had stopped chopping, just paused. The touch had lasted maybe 2 seconds, but now it glowed like a sun-warmed stone resting beneath his collarbone. There had been no ceremony to it, no flirtation, no reason. It wasn't like the way she touched him when they lay curled together under furs, half asleep and dreaming. It wasn't even like the way she held his hand when they walked into town. Slightly nervous, slightly proud. No, this was something quieter, older, almost invisible. It was the kind of touch a woman gives, not because she's thinking about love, but because she's already in it, a natural thing, an instinct, as if her hand couldn't pass that close without reaching. For him, as if his shoulder was simply where her fingers belonged. He watched her stir the pot. She hadn't noticed him pause, hadn't looked back, didn't need to, because her touch said everything already. Later that day, when she returned to the loom and began counting threads again, he crossed the room with a small bowl of honeyed barley and placed it beside her without a word. She looked up, surprised. "You didn't need to." "I wanted to," he said. She smiled, a slow, curious smile, then reached up, absent-mindedly again, and touched his wrist. Some moments never become memories, they just become part of who you are. And from that day on, whenever she passed behind him, her hand always found his shoulder. A simple, wordless hello, and each time it echoed just the same. The morning had been filled with small tasks: mending a cracked bucket, patching the thatch near the door, folding linens that smelled faintly of birch and soap root. He had been working most of the morning, his sleeves rolled up, his brow furrowed, in concentration. He never made a fuss about it, just went about the work like he was born to carry weight. She liked watching him sometimes, quietly from across the room, not for the strength in his arms, but for the gentleness that lived beside it. When she came to his side to hand him a spool of new thread, he didn't look up immediately. His hands were full, busy with tying a knot, fingers stiff with old splinters and winter calluses. She noticed, suddenly, just how worn they were, and without thinking, she reached out, gently laying her hands over his. He paused, not startled, just still, as if her touch had softened something deeper than skin. "Your hands," she said, voice low and curious. "They're so strong." She turned one of them over in hers, her thumb brushing slowly along his palm, tracing old lines, old blisters, old stories. He looked at her then, really looked. The fire flickered behind her. The air smelled of cedar, shavings and smoke, and her voice, it was soft, in that way only her voice could be. The kind of softness that made you listen with your whole chest. He didn't answer with words. He didn't need to. Instead, he reached up with the back of one rough hand and let it brush gently against her cheek. His knuckles grazed, her skin like wind through barley's low reverent, unsure of their welcome. But longing to stay, she didn't flinch, didn't pull away, didn't even blink. She simply closed her eyes and leaned into it. And in that single, wordless gesture, he understood. She wasn't just allowing his touch. She wasn't just allowing his touch. She was inviting it. The scars on his hands didn't frighten her. The strength didn't intimidate her. She saw all of Itand, placed her soft, quiet trust into his palms. No vows were spoken, no declarations made, but it was, in its own small way, a promise that his hands made for rowing ships, swinging axes. Hauling nets could also hold gentleness, could also hold her. When she opened her eyes again, her fingers still rested lightly. Over his, he said only 2 words. "I'll be careful." She smiled. "Good," she whispered, "because I'm not." She found it early, just as the light was creeping in through the slats of the shutters. A small piece of driftwood, smooth and pale, left quietly on the little bench beside their bed. Not tied with ribbon, not perfumed or painted, just simple. Wood, no larger than her palm. At first she thought he'd forgotten to throw it in the fire. But when she turned it over, she saw the carving. 3 words, crooked, uneven, careful, your laugh heals. She sat on the edge of the bed, barefoot, heart suddenly loud. He wasn't there. Out tending the goats maybe, or fetching water. The longhouse was hushed, the embers in the hearth still glowing gently from the night before. She ran her thumb over the letters each, one cut deep, with the kind of effort that only comes from someone unused to carving words. He hadn't signed it, but he didn't need to, that day. She slipped it quietly into the pocket of her apron. She told no one. And when she bent over the stew pot, or scrubbed laundry, or laughed too loud in the market, she'd feel its weight, there just a small reminder that someone had noticed, that someone had seen her, not just her hands, or her work, or her place at his side, but her. She didn't speak of it. Not even to him. She didn't ask why he'd written it, or what had made him think of her laugh, or why he'd chosen driftwood instead of paper, because sometimes love blooms in silence, and sometimes asking would only make the magic smaller. Weeks passed. One morning, she left a wooden spoon by his boots. On the back of its handle, carved in tiny, crooked runes, "You walk like the sea." He never asked what it meant, but he never stopped smiling either. And so the quiet letters continued, not daily, not expected, not even explained. A line about the clouds, carved into a piece of bone. A joke about a cow, scratched into the underside of a comb. A tiny sun, etched onto the bark of a firewood log she'd bring in to find. They never called it writing, but if anyone had ever asked, years later, when they'd first said "I love you," they'd both answer with driftwood, before we even knew we had. Not every kiss needs to happen to be remembered. The storeroom smelled of dried thyme and old wood. Dust hung in sunlit shafts, floating silently above burlap sacks of barley and rows of bundled herbs. It was the kind of quiet, dim space where sound didn't dare raise its voice. She was balancing a basket of dried fish in one hand and trying not to knock over a hanging bunch of lavender with the other. He was crouched nearby, examining the knots on a sack of salt, his forehead creased with that familiar look of over-serious concentration. They hadn't meant to end up alone in there, but they were. She stepped back. Her heel caught the edge of an old wooden pallet. She wobbled just for a second, and he was already there, hands on her arms, steadying, gentle, firm, and when she looked up, they were close, too close. His chest rose and fell a little faster now. She felt it, their foreheads nearly touched. His breath stirred a wisp of hair against her cheek. One of her hands, still holding the basket, had landed softly against his chest. The room seemed to narrow. Or maybe time did, because for one long, unblinking moment, neither of them moved. They didn't speak, didn't joke, didn't break the spell. They just looked, and there, in that flicker of breath and heartbeat, they both knew this was the moment where a kiss could happen, but it didn't sink all instead. She shifted slightly, slowly, not pulling away just enough to breathe again. He stepped back, hands falling to his sides. Not coldly, just respectfully, carefully. She smiled at him, lips parted just a little, eyes saying more than her voice ever could. He smiled back, nervous, warm, real. They left the storeroom together. The fish was still in her basket. The salt, still UNKNOTTED. Nothing had changed, except everything had that night. She lay awake longer than usual, fingers brushing her own lips. Not touching, just remembering. He lay beside her, his arm lightly touching hers, and thought of how close her face had been. Neither spoke of it, because some moments live better in memory than in retelling, and some almost kisses become their own kind of love story. It was just a moment, a simple offer. He held out the drinking horn, filled halfway with spiced mead, warmed by the hearth. She was stirring stew with one hand, hair tied in a messy braid, her sleeves damp from washing turnips. She turned to him, blinking. He said nothing, just held the horn out. She took it, and as she raised it to her lips, she noticed the warmth where his mouth had been, the faintest trace of it, like a secret. She drank from that very spot, slowly, not a big sip, not hurried. When she handed it back, their fingers brushed. Just a little. He didn't say anything. Neither did she, but that moment stretched, like sunlight across a winter floor, longer than it needed to. A few minutes later, he passed it to her again, still warm. He asked, casually. She nodded, not trusting her voice. She sipped again, more confidently this time, and when she handed it back, she smiled. The stew was soon forgotten. The mead, not particularly strong, seemed to last all evening, passed back and forth as they sat near the fire, him mending a leather strap, her peeling root vegetables they didn't need until tomorrow. Every time he handed it to her, she drank from his side, and every time he took it back, he tilted the horn just slightly, to drink from hers. No one mentioned it, no one needed to. It was just a shared cup, but in its quiet journey between them, it carried more than mead. It carried a new closeness, unspoken and unforced, the kind that builds slowly, like snow layering. A roof. Quiet, shore. Soft. Later that night, as they got ready to sleep. He set the empty horn gently beside the bed. She smiled at it as though it were a letter, and in the silence that followed, she whispered, "It tasted better that way." He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't need to. The longhouse was quiet, save for the crackle of dying embers and the occasional creak of settling wood. She lay curled beneath the thick fur blanket, her back to him, arms tucked beneath her chest, eyes closed, breathing slow, not asleep. Not quite, just still enough to let the moment unfold. He shifted behind her, the mattress of straw our Westy led, then dashed softly. Tentatively, he began to hum. It was a melody from somewhere deep in memory, one of those old lullabies sung around hearths during long winters, half remembered, slightly out of tune, but gentle. His voice was rough around the edges, as if unused to singing, but low, warm, and steady, and real. She didn't move, didn't give herself away, even when her heart began to ache a little at the sound. Not a painful ache, just the kind that comes when you realize someone has begun to hold you in their thoughts. The quiet, private moments they think no one sees. The song wasn't long. It had no real words, just fragments of sound passed from mother to child long ago, and still it wrapped around her like another blanket. He paused once. She held her breath, then, after a moment, he started again, softer this time, as if afraid of waking her. She wondered if he even knew he was doing it, or if it had simply slipped out of him, something that belonged to before now, given to them when he finally stopped. She heard him shift again, settling behind her, closer. Now not touching, but nearly, his breath warm at the back of her neck. She wanted to turn, to say something, to thank him, to ask for the song again, but she didn't. She stayed still, listening to the silence that followed, so full of meaning it didn't need filling. Later, as sleep finally came, her last thought was, he doesn't. No, I heard it, but I'll never forget. It was late afternoon, the kind where golden light slants through the slats of the longhouse, and everything seems to hush. She was weaving near the fire, nimble fingers tugging wool into shape. He sat nearby, sharpening a blade, but not really focused. Their conversation had been slow, unhurried, the kind that drifts between memory and silence like a leaf on water. She told him about her mother, about the lullabies, the way she used to hum during storms, and then quietly, as if offering a small secret, she said, she used to call me Lila, little one dot. Just once, just soft enough that she could pretend she hadn't said it if he didn't respond. But he did. He looked at her, not surprised, not amused, just still. And then, after a long pause, he tried it. Lila, he said, not questioning, not testing, just saying, like holding something fragile in his hand. She didn't speak, but her eyes lifted from the wool, slow as moonrise, and her lips curved into a smile, delicate, hesitant, radiant. Not a smile for the joke he sometimes made, not a smile for others, a smile for him. He didn't say it again, not then, just tucked it away, somewhere quiet in his heart, like a charm stone or a lock of hair. But days later, when she burned her fingers on the hearth and muttered under her breath, he came to her side and said, "It's all right, Lila." And when they sat together at the riverbank, not talking, just watching clouds, he reached out and said, "Come here, Lila," as if he'd always known her. She never told anyone else she'd shared the name, and he never used it in front of others, only in soft, private moments, only when the air between them was still, only when he wanted her to know he saw the girl she had been, and cherished the woman she'd become. She had told him the story once, almost in passing. It was about her grandmother's farmhouse. When she was small, she used to believe a fox lived beneath the barn floor, a clever one with golden eyes and a crooked tail, who only came out at dusk. It wasn't a long story, not an important one, but he had listened, and he had remembered. It took him 3 evenings, while she was out gathering herbs, or visiting her aunt across the stream, or simply sleeping with her back to him. He carved, in secret, a scrap of birchwood from the fire pile, his smallest blade, and the memory of her voice as she spoke of that imaginary fox. He didn't try to make it perfect. The ears were a little too big, the tail too thick, but the eyes tiny and thoughtful. He shaped with care, and when it was done, he held it for a long time. Just held it. Then he wrapped it in a scrap of soft cloth and placed it beside her pillow. He didn't leave a note. The next morning, she found it. She didn't say anything, not right away, but her fingers touched it gently, like something delicate or sacred. She held it in her palm for the longest time. Then she stood, opened the little leather pouch she wore around her neck for herbs and trinkets, and tucked the fox inside. She wore it every day after that. He never asked about it, and she never offered an explanation. But sometimes, when the fire was low and their hands brushed, she would look at him with eyes that said, "I saw what you did," and his would answer, "I know." It was just a common something, he mumbled, without thinking, half teasing, half true. He was carving a spoon. She was kneading bread. The morning had been quiet, the kind of quiet only new couples know, soft, respectful, full of pauses, and then he said it, something about the way she folded the dough like she was scolding it. Nothing profound, just enough. She burst out laughing, not the polite kind, not the reserved kind expected of new Viking wives with good manners, but a full, unguarded laugh, bright and wide, like sunlight cracking through smoke. It filled the longhouse. Heads turned, a few chuckled. One of the elders even smiled into his beard, but mostly people watched her, watched the way her eyes crinkled, watched the way her head tilted back, watched her hands, flour-covered, flying up to cover her face in sudden embarrassment. He watched her dot, and then, softly, he stepped forward and reached for her wrists. She resisted a moment just long enough to be bashful. Then she let him pull, her hands gently down from her face. "Let me see that again," he said. Her cheeks were pink now. She was trying not to smile, trying and failing. He looked at her like he'd never seen anything more important. Not his tools, not the farm, not even his father's old sword hanging by the door. Just her, this girl who laughed like no one was listening. This woman who, without meaning to, had made the entire longhouse feel warmer. She leaned forward and bumped her forehead lightly against his chest. "Don't say things like that," she whispered. "Why not?" he asked, smirking. "Because I won't be able to stop laughing next time." He didn't say anything, just smiled, and silently promised himself, "I'll spend the rest of my life trying." The first rays of sun entered not with grandeur, but with gentleness, as if even the light itself knew something tender had taken place inside the longhouse that night. The bride did not stir at once. She lay beneath the woolen furs, her body still, the warmth of another person just barely behind him, her husband. The man whose name she had spoken with uncertainty only a day before. Now, sleeping with a familiarity beside her, that unsettled and softened her in equal measure. His breath was deep, steady, and slow. She could feel it against the back of her neck. It had not been what she expected. Not the wedding, not the night, not the waking. The stories she'd been told growing up were different, bolder, louder, some darker, some far too romantic to ever be real. But this had been something quiet, something that had unfolded like wool unwinding from a spindle, awkward at moments, unsure, but gentle. And now here they were, not bride and groom anymore, husband and wife. She slipped out from under the furs, slowly, careful not to wake him, stepping onto the struccored floor with bare feet. The longhouse was still, a rare quiet before the day began. The coals in the hearth were nearly out. The smell of wood smoke hung low, mingling with herbs strung from the rafters and the trace of their mingled skin. She reached for her shift and pulled it over her head. It still felt strange to dress again, as if clothing were too much now. She caught her reflection faintly in a warped piece of bronze that served as a looking glass. Her hair was wild, unbraided from the night before. There were soft creases on her neck from where she had slept. Her lips were slightly swollen from she didn't let herself think that far yet. She left the sleeping chamber without sound. The rest of the longhouse was empty, save for a cat that watched her with the knowing look of a creature that had seen too much and judged none of it. She passed through the corridor of hanging cloaks, jars, ropes of garlic, and finally she stepped into the morning light. The cold bit at her skin like it had every morning of her life, but today it surprised her, as if she had expected to be different now. Warmer, changed, and maybe she was, but the world around her had not shifted. The smoke still rose from other homes. The earth was still damp from the night. Somewhere, someone was already hammering something against something else. She walked down the narrow path behind the house where the bathhouse stood. It was little more than a hut of steam and stones, but it had its own quiet magic. She stepped inside and stoked the fire beneath the stones. It took time. Everything did. She fetched water, as she had since girlhood, filled the trough, watched it begin to steam as heat kissed the surface. She undressed again, slowly this time, aware of her limbs in a new way. She slid into the bath, sinking to her chin, letting the heat seep into her bones. Her hands floated. She looked at them, small, calloused, but clean now. He had kissed these hands, not just once, not just perfunctorily, but with something close to reverence. The memories from the night returned in flickers. Not a single moment, but many. The way he had lit the candles instead of simply blowing out the fire. The way he had touched her shoulder and then paused, giving her space to lean in or not. The way his voice had trembled slightly when he'd asked if she was all right. Even after, when everything was done and they were tangled in the same furs, staring at the dark ceiling beams above them. He hadn't tried to impress her, that was the part that lingered. He hadn't tried to be a hero, or a conqueror, or even a poet. He had just been him, quiet, awkward, careful, strong in a way that didn't need showing off, she had thought. Marriage would feel like a gate slamming shut, a thing that trapped. But now, soaking in the water, steam rising, heart slow, she wasn't sure. It didn't feel like she'd stepped into a cage. It felt like she had stepped through a door, into a room she had never seen before, one that already smelled faintly like home. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't thinking about what she needed to do next. The hearth was nearly out, but a single ember pulsed low beneath the ashes, one last heartbeat of warmth from the fire that had watched them through the night. The longhouse had fallen quiet, save for the soft shuffle of the wind outside brushing against the timber walls. In the corner where the thickest woolen blankets had been spread over layered straw and sheepskin, the bride stirred but only just. She didn't open her eyes at first. She wasn't ready for the day yet. Not with the air still heavy with the scent of wood smoke, iron, salt, and something else, something new. The warmth of another body still hovered faintly near her, even though he had risen before dawn. She reached out with her hand, not to grasp, but to feel what was left behind. The wool beneath her palm was cool, but near her shoulder, the furs still held his shape, slightly pressed inward. She lingered there, tracing that hollow with idle fingertips. Last night had passed like a long-held breath. Neither of them had spoken much. The words they had exchanged were not the ones expected of newlyweds, no giddy laughter or breathless vows. Just slow, soft sentences shared between strangers, made intimate by the flicker of firelight and the closeness of skin under covers. The marriage had been arranged, of course, as most were. Her father, practicable, his chieftain, strategic. A union forged not out of courtship but caution, designed to settle a quiet feud and link to modest settlements by kin. And yet, in that silence they shared after the feast, after the toasts and the binding, something had started to move between them. He had not rushed her. That was the part she still turned over and over in her mind like a smooth pebble in her apron pocket. No roughness, no demand, just presence, just heat and breath, and the way he'd watched her with a reverence he hadn't yet earned, as if waiting for permission not just from her body, but from her soul. She remembered the way his hands hovered over her shoulders before ever touching her, how he had waited until her hand rose, tentative, and touched his wrist. Only then had he let his palm rest gently against her. The way he exhaled, so deeply, when she leaned in closer, as if the tension he had carried into the marriage broke free from his ribs in that one breath. And now, the morning after, there was no applause, no announcement, no witnessing, just a quiet echo, the kind that leaves something in your chest, not emptiness, but a fullness that's too gentle to name. The door creaked open slightly. She turned her head on the pillow of bundled fabric. He stood there, framed by the greyish light of dawn, carrying a wooden bowl of water that steamed faintly in the cold. His cloak was damp at the shoulders, from either mist or sweat, and his hair was tousled from the wind. He looked different now, less like the man she had been promised to, and more like the one she had met only hours ago when the walls between them had started to lower. "I didn't want to wake you," he said. His voice gravelled and low, not with cold, but sleep. There was frost on the goat's trough. "I thought you might want warm water for your face." She sat up slowly, clutching the woolen shawl around her as she did. "You remembered," she said. He set the bowl down near the edge of the bedding, then crouched beside it to unfasten his boots. "I listen," he murmured, "even when I look like I don't." She didn't say anything, just leaned forward to dip a corner of cloth into the bowl and pressed it to her cheek, letting the warmth soak in. "I wasn't sure if you'd want company this morning," he added, "but I didn't want to be gone when you woke." He said it plainly, without expectation, not tender, not cold, just a statement, offered like a loaf of bread left by a door. She looked at him, then, really looked, the angle of his jaw, the broadness of his shoulders, but more than that the slight nervousness tucked behind his eyes, the careful way he sat near her, but not close enough to touch, the way his fingers played quietly with the leather strap of his belt. "I don't mind," she said. "That you stayed, that was enough for now." She wasn't ready to smile yet. She wasn't ready for affection, or warmth, or hands. But she was ready for presence, for nearness that didn't demand anything in return. He nodded, looking down at the floor. The quiet stretched, but not uncomfortably. There was something in the silence between them that was beginning to feel familiar, like a shared understanding, wordless and warm. Outside, the village was beginning to stir. A distant clatter of buckets, the low bleating of a sheep, and the squeal of a turning cartwheel. Life beginning again, the way it always did. He stood again and crossed to the fire, nudging the ash aside with a poker and placing new kindling with practiced hands. As he coaxed the flame back to life, she watched him, noting the way his body moved, not just with strength, but care. It struck her that she had never watched a man move quietly before. Not like this, not like someone who understood that silence, had a shape and sound of its own. "You don't speak much," she said after a while. He glanced over his shoulder. "No, I've learnt not to fill up silence just because it's there." "Is it something you were taught?" she asked. or something you learned the hard way?" He paused, placing a log on the flame. "Both." She nodded slowly. "That's a good answer." He gave a small laugh. "It wasn't meant to be clever. It wasn't, but it was kind." She reached for the warm cloth again, dabbing her neck this time. He poured her a cup of warm mead from the clay jug near the hearth, and brought it to her with both hands. She took it, their fingers brushing, and this time she didn't pull away. "I thought marriage would feel like a wall," she said, after a long sip. "Something built around me, or over me." He sat cross-legged beside her. "And does it?" She considered. "No, not yet. Right now, it feels more like a gate, one that opens inward." He was quiet. "Then, I hope I don't close it." "You haven't," she said, outside. A bird chirped Jeswanand. The thin light began to filter more strongly through the thatched gaps of the longhouse roof. He reached into his belt pouch and drew out a small, smooth stone, etched with the faint outline of a spiral. He placed it gently on the floor between them. "My sister gave it to me when she married," he said. "She told me to give it to my bride, if ever I was lucky enough to have one." The stone was nothing extravagant, just river smooth with lines carefully carved. She picked it up, turned it over, and ran her thumb across the spiral. "It means beginning," he added, "not ending." He shook his head. "Not unless you carve it backwards." She traced the shape again, feeling something stir in her chest. Not longing, exactly, but something near it. Something like a seed, not yet opened. "Thank you," she said softly. He didn't reply, just reached forward and tucked the edge of her shawl more snugly round her shoulder, his knuckles barely brushing her collarbone, and she let him. The name itself wasn't rare. Others had spoken it, her mother, her kin, even the village elders, who mumbled it from parchment scrolls when she was baptized beside the carved stones. She had heard it in passing and in warning, in lullabies, and in scolding. But when he said it that morning, her nemet sounded like something carved, as though each syllable had been held in his hands before he offered it to her. It wasn't just spoken, it was given. He said it quietly, not long, after the morning had thickened, when the longhouse was fully alive and she had begun to braid her hair with shaking fingers. The day's first fire had taken hold, and the stew pot was already beginning to scent the room with root vegetables and charred bone. She sat on the edge of the shared bed, her back to him, her knees drawn slightly in. The wool blanket was still, wrapped around her legs. She hadn't yet dressed fully, only tugged her undershift over bare shoulders. Her fingers were fumbling with the plaits clumsy, slow. She kept unraveling them and starting over. She wasn't used to the stillness after such a night, the strange quiet where no one intruded but everything still trembled. Then he spoke her name, not loudly, just enough that it caught the air between them like smoke. She froze, not in fear, but surprise. He had not said it once during the whole of the wedding day. Not during the feast, not during the binding, not even the night itself. He had called her wife once, gently, with hesitance. But not this. She turned her head slightly, only her eyes shifting toward him. He was kneeling beside the trunk where he kept his tools, sorting through coils of leather cord and wooden clasps. He didn't look up. He just said it again, her name, softly, with a little more shape behind it, like he was tasting it properly for the first time. "Is that what you call me?" she asked, not coldly, not teasingly. Simply, he sat back on his heels and met her eyes. "It's what you told me the first time we spoke." "That was weeks ago," she said, "and only once." I remembered, he said. Because of how you said it, you looked like you weren't sure if I deserved to know it. She blinked. Her braid had fallen again. He stood, slowly, and approached. His boots made no sound across the rushes, and when he knelt behind her, she did not pull. "Away, may I?" he asked, his hands hovering near her hair. She nodded once. His fingers were rough, calloused from rope and hilt, but they moved gently, with a craftsman's care. He parted the hair slowly, twisting it into the simplest of braids, not decorative. Not ornate, but sturdy and clean. "You braid like a soldier," she said after a while. "I was one," he replied, "before I learned to fish." She tilted her head slightly so he could finish the end. "And before that, he tied off the braid and rested his hands loosely in his lap. Before that," he said, "I was a boy who watched his mother plait her own hair by firelight. I learned from her, though she never let me touch it." "Why not?" "She didn't trust my hands not to pull," he said with a crooked smile. She laughed quietly, not a full laugh, but the first he had heard from her mouth, free of tension. It warmed the space between them like a second fire. She turned slightly, so she could face him more fully, and for the first time they were nearly knee to knee. Seated low on the rushes, the braid he'd made fell over her shoulder like a woven path, and she ran her fingers over it, gently, thoughtfully. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For saying it," she answered. "My name." He looked at her a long moment. "May I keep saying it?" he asked, with a half smile. "You may," she said, "but not when others are near." He raised a brow. "Why not?" "Because then it becomes just a word again," she said, "not something earned." He nodded slowly, as though this made perfect sense. There was a pause. "Then, I don't know yours," she said suddenly. "Not truly, you do," he replied. "It was spoken at the binding." "Yes, but I don't know how you want it to be said." He tilted his head. "And how would you say it?" She tried it, gently his name, spoken as if for the first time. She left space between the syllables, watched his face for any flicker of reaction. He closed his eyes briefly, almost like the sound of it struck something deep in his ribs. "That," he said, "just like that." She smiled then, small, soft, but real. They sat like that for a while, no need to fill the air, just exchanging names like offerings at an altar. A little later, as the longhouse filled with quiet bustle cousins and uncles, workers heading in for bread, the low murmur of daily rhythms, he stood and brought her a cloak lined with soft fleece, fastened with a bronze pin shaped like a wave. "From my mother," he said. "She wore it on her wedding day." She looked at it for a long moment, then pulled it over her shoulders. He fastened it for her. She looked up at him and said his name again. Just once, he touched the braid over her shoulder, gently, and for the first time in their new home. Their names belonged to each other, and no one else. There are days in a Viking marriage that are built on fire and feasts, on guests and toasts, and nights that blur into sleep before the last candle goes out. But not every day needs such noise. Some days begin in silence, and some silences become holy things. It was the third morning after the wedding, a grey, wet one. The rain hadn't stopped all night. Tit had whispered across the longhouse roof like a cloak being dragged over wooden bones, and when the sun finally pushed its way into the sky, it did so weakly, as though half-hearted about its own arrival. She woke first, not by much, but enough that the house was still breathing softly around them, and the fire had gone to embers. The wool blanket had slipped from her shoulder during the night, and his arms, still heavy with sleep, rested across her hip. She could feel the warmth of him, but not the pressure. He did not clutch. He never clutched. Even in sleep, his touch was more like presence than possession. She stared at the smoke-dark beams above them, thinking of nothing and everything. Her stomach was quiet, her mouth dry. She thought of bread. She slipped out from beneath the blanket, careful not to wake him. The hearth was cold. There were no maids at this hour, no bustling aunts or gossiping cousins, just the coals, dim red, and the soft pat of her feet on the straw-laid floor. She pulled her cloak around her shoulders, fetched a copper pot from the hook, filled it with a little water, and set it near the coals to warm. The bread was from 2 days ago. Still good. Viking loaves were dense, coarse, packed with barley and rye. She broke to pieces and laid them on the wooden board beside a thick slice of goat cheese and a small pat of salt dot. As she knelt near the hearth, feeding dry twigs to the flame, she heard his footsteps. He didn't speak, just moved quietly, barefoot, his tunic only half-laced. His hair, usually tied, hung loose still, messy from sleep. He sat beside her without asking, cross-legged, like a boy again. She noticed the corner of his eye still held the creases of a pillow together. They watched the fire rise again. When the water steamed faintly, she poured it into 2 wooden cups and steeped a small bundle of dried herbs, nettles and chamomile, and something sharp and sweet she couldn't name. He took his cup with both hands. No thank you, no praise, just a small nod. She liked that. She handed him one half of the bread and took the other. They ate slowly, deliberately, like people who had all the time in the world and no plans to fill it. There were no words between them yet. None were needed. The cheese was a little sour, the crust of the bread rough against the teeth, but somehow it tasted more honest than anything she'd had at the wedding feast. She watched him chew, watched his mouth press flat, his eyes squint slightly at the salt. There was something vulnerable about how men ate when they thought no one noticed. He glanced sideways at her and smiled just faintly in. She smiled back. Outside, the rain had lightened. It tapped gently against the wood, like a child knocking politely. The longhouse was waking. She could hear a rooster to farms over, the soft creak of ox carts beginning their work. But inside, their corner by the hearth still felt like a quiet pocket sealed from the world. She refilled their cups. He handed her his without speaking, but their fingers brushed when she took it. Neither of them flinched. The moment passed like a ripple. Then he cleared his throat once softly, almost apologetically. "I used to eat like this with my brother," he said, "when we were boys, before he took the ship south." She didn't ask what happened to the brother. She just looked at him, steady, and said, "Did he like salt with his bread too?" He laughed, a real laugh this time. "No, he used to say it ruined the grain. Called me a spoiled hound for using it." "I like it," she said, taking another bite. "It makes the morning feel ... sharper." They both looked down at the crumbs in their laps. Then she said, "I used to eat with my sister before she married. Do you miss her?" "I miss her more when it's raining." He nodded, as though he understood exactly what that meant. For a while, they said nothing again, just drank their tea and listened to the small crackle of fire. And it was during that silence that something settled. Not loudly, not suddenly, just a tiny, invisible hinge clicking into place. The kind of silence that is shared, not filled. He reached for her hand, palm up, and she gave it to him without ceremony. Not to grip, not to pull, just to hold. They sat like that, hand in hand, eating the last of the bread and salt, watching the fire reflect in the silver rim of the teapot. And later, when the longhouse fully awoke, and the world called them back into it, she remembered this moment not as grand or bold, but as the day they learned how to be still beside one another. It would not be their last quiet morning, but it would always be the first. The embers in the hearth had died to a warm pulse by the time the first morning light seeped beneath the door. It was not a golden light, but a grey one filtered through mist and the breath of sleeping animals. Soft against the wood-beamed ceiling, no roosters crowed. No one came to disturb them. The longhouse, for once, respected the silence. She lay curled beneath the wool blanket, her cheek pressed into the rough linen, the scent of smoke and salt clinging to the fabric. Her herringband now spilled across her shoulder in loose tangles, bits of it caught in the weave of her neat shift. For a long time she did not move, she simply listened. The slow draw and release of breath behind her, the groan of wood beneath shifting weight, the low hum of the house beginning to wake around them. She was not sure when he had turned toward her in the night, or when the distance between them had narrowed so quietly, as if in sleep their bodies had remembered something their minds had not yet spoken. Now she could feel the heat of him close, but not touching, not quite, and then she felt it. The lightest brush of his hand, hesitant, against the edge of the blanket where it covered her shoulder. Not a full touch, just the weight of a finger, the uncertain pause of a man unused to softness. It lingered there for a breath, maybe two, then retreated. She stayed still, not because she didn't want to answer it, but because she didn't yet know how. Her body was awake, yes, but her heart was still gathering itself. Last night had not been loud or passionate. It had been quiet, awkward, tender in a way that hurt a little, simply because it was real. The truth was, they had spoken. Little, he had not rushed her, nor she him. They had eaten their wedding bread side by side in the hush of a room emptied of ceremony, and she had watched the way he chewed in silence. She had noticed the small scar at his temple, the way he poured the mead with both hands as if afraid he might drop it. And when she had stepped toward the bed, it was she who had taken the first breath and said, "Come when you are ready." Now he was behind her husband, by law and oaths, and yet neither of them had spoken since their few murmured words in the dark. A wedding night that had not broken anything open, but stitched something gently together. She stirred, just slightly. Her shoulder shifted beneath the blanket, her hair falling further down her back. She did not turn, but she knew he saw it. She felt it in the change of his breath. Outside, faintly, a goat bleated. The low groan of someone rolling a barrel down the path toward the smokehouse followed life, resuming, slow and unaware that something fragile had been planted in the quiet of their room. He sat up. She heard it wood creaking beneath him, the slight rustle of furs being pulled back. Still, he said nothing, but she sensed his pause, the way he waited before standing, perhaps giving her a moment, perhaps afraid that movement would startle. The morning, she turned then, slowly, her eyes opened to the sight of him standing at the edge of the bed, shirtless, his hair mussed from sleep. He was reaching for his tunic when he saw her watching. He froze, not out of shame, but surprise. And then he smiled. It was a soft smile, uncertain, a little sheepish, the kind of smile men rarely let themselves wear. It touched the corner of his mouth and barely reached his eyes, but it was there, a peace offering made of expression. She didn't return it right away, but she held his gaze. That was enough. "I'll stoke the fire," he said, his voice low and a little husky. "And fetch water." She nodded once, then tucked the blanket around her again. It felt easier now. This silence, it didn't feel like fear anymore. It felt like a kind of language, learned slowly, like carving runes into stone. He left the room barefoot, boots in hand. She listened to the distant sound of the bucket being lifted, the groan of hinges on the outer door, and the crows overhead beginning to mark the sky. She sat up. Her hair fell forward, thick and tangled. She found a wooden comb on the edge of the small chest and began working through it slowly. Each tug hurt, but it was a pain that belonged to her alone, a small ritual of waking. There were faint marks on her skin, from sleep, from the night. Not bruises, not quite, just impressions, of linen, of breath, of having been held, awkwardly but honestly, for the first time. When he returned, she was sitting on the bench near the hearth. She had added wood to the embers, but not yet lit it. Her feet were tucked beneath her shift. She did not look up at first. Only when the door shut behind him did she raise her eyes. He was holding the bucket in both hands. His shirt still hung, loose. His hair was damp from the well water he'd likely splashed over his face. There was a bloom of cold color in his cheeks. "I thought I might make porridge," he said. She nodded again, this time with a slight tilt of her head. He set the bucket down, grabbed the small iron pot, and began measuring oats without asking. He moved a little clumsily used to war camps, not kitchens, but she didn't correct him. Instead, she watched and listened, watched the way his hands trembled just slightly when they passed too close to hers, listened to the way he breathed when the fire caught and flared into life. It was quiet for a long time. Then he asked, softly, "Did you sleep at all?" She paused, then answered a little. Another moment passed. "I didn't snore, did I?" A pause. Then a slow smile from her. Small, private, but it was a smile. No, that was all it took. A weight lifted from the room. Not completely, but a little. Enough that the air felt less heavy. He chuckled, very quietly, and returned to stirring the pot. "I usually do," he admitted. "Or so I'm told." "Then perhaps you were nervous." He turned to look at her. Not shocked, but open, honest. "Perhaps I was," he said. And there it was again, that strange, delicate bridge they were building between them, plank by plank, silence by silence. Not love, not yet, but something tender, something willing. She stood, eventually, stepped to the table, sat without being asked. He brought the porridge, served it unevenly, and muttered something about needing better ladles. She didn't answer, only raised the spoon to her lips and blew gently. They ate like that, together, quietly, and when he rose to clear the bowls, he paused again behind her. Just for a moment, she could feel him there close, still not touching. But the presence was enough. She reached back, only with one hand, found his wrist, held it. Gently he froze. Then he covered her hand with his own. That was all. No kiss, no vow, no poetry, just two people married by law, beginning to understand what it might mean to be joined by something more. Not fire, not passion, but patience, and slowly a kind of peace.